I've always worked the graveyard shift at St. Augustine's Hospital. It's a place that feels abandoned even when it's full of patients, a strange, almost forgotten facility that was built in the early 1900s, its old bones creaking with age. The walls are yellowed with time, and the dim fluorescent lights flicker like they're barely holding onto the promise of light. I've seen some things here over the years, strange things, things that never quite made sense, but nothing could have prepared me for the night things truly started to unravel. It began when I received an emergency call about a new patient, a woman in her early 30s, apparently found wandering the streets in a daze. They brought her in on a gurney, her face pale and eyes wide open, staring into nothingness as if she were trapped in a world no one else could see. The doctors were baffled. They couldn't find any visible injuries or signs of trauma, but something about her felt off. The way she moved, like a marionette with invisible strings pulling her limbs. They put her in room 312, a solitary, secluded room at the end of the long corridor. I was assigned to keep an eye on her through the night. I had always thought of myself as tough, immune to the eerie atmosphere of this place. But the moment I set foot in that hallway, the air felt thick, like the walls themselves were alive. The smell of antiseptic was replaced by a damp, musty odor, and I could hear faint whispers echoing from the end of the hall, though I was certain I was alone. As I approached room 312, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the room was cold, too cold. The air didn't move, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my feet. She was lying on the bed, her eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling. But she wasn't blinking, and there was no sign of life in her face. I checked her vitals. Everything seemed normal, but there was an unsettling tension in the room that I couldn't shake. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was wrong. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the lights flickered intermittently. I tried to ignore the growing unease in my stomach and went to check the monitors. The heart rate was stable, the oxygen levels normal, but then the monitor beeped erratically, a high-pitched whine that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned around to see the woman's head slowly tilt toward me. Her neck made a grotesque crackling sound, as if the bones were grinding against each other. Her eyes followed me with an unnerving precision, unblinking. "Help me," she whispered, her voice hoarse and strained, as if it didn't belong to her. My stomach lurched, and I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. What do you mean?" I stammered, my voice shaking. She didn't answer, but her gaze intensified, the silence stretching long enough to drive me insane. Then, without warning, her body jerked upright, sitting up with unnatural speed. Her arms flailed out in a violent motion, knocking over a nearby tray. The sound of the glass shattering echoed through the room, and I froze in place, too terrified to move. Her mouth opened wide, too wide, and the sound that came from her throat was a guttural growl, something not human. The lights above flickered violently, and the air grew colder, sharper, as if the room itself was exhaling a breath of death. I backed away toward the door, but just as I reached for the handle, the woman's voice came again. But this time, it was no longer just her voice. It was multiple voices, layered on top of each other, speaking in a chorus of despair. "Leave, before it's too late. You can't escape. We never left." The whispers grew louder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and sway as if they had a life of their own. My head spun, and the fear that gripped my heart was overwhelming. I bolted out of the room, but as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I realized something was horribly wrong. The lights in the hallway flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, shuffling footsteps that echoed in the empty hall. I turned, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there, just the faint sound of breathing, heavy and labored, coming from the very walls themselves. I ran, heart racing, my feet slapping against the cold, sterile floor. The hallway seemed to stretch longer, the doors lining the walls growing farther apart, until it felt like I was running through an endless labyrinth. The whispers continued, now mixed with distorted voices of patients from other rooms, their voices mournful and pleading. I turned a corner and saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was a nurse, or at least it looked like one. Her white uniform was stained with something dark, and her face was obscured by shadows. She reached out a hand toward me, and I froze, paralyzed by fear. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull me in. I backed away, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. And then, in an instant, the figure was gone, as if swallowed by the very shadows themselves. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "It's too late now," they hissed. "We're all trapped forever." I stumbled to the nearest exit, desperate for a way out, but the doors wouldn't open. I pounded on the glass, screaming, but no one answered. The air was suffocating now, thick with the stench of decay. The whispers were all around me, crawling under my skin, filling my head with maddening voices. I collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down my face as the darkness closed in. I knew then there was no escape from St. Augustine's. The hospital had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others. And soon, I would be just another voice in the darkness, another whisper that would echo through the halls for eternity. The air in St. Mark's Hospital has always had a certain heaviness to it, a stale, metallic scent that lingers in every corridor. But tonight, it felt different, darker, like something was pressing against the walls, something alive. It wasn't the usual sounds that keep me on edge during my late-night shifts, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, the occasional beep of a distant heart monitor, but the silence. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me, suffocating me, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to make the first move. It started innocently enough. I was checking on the patients on the lower floors, making my rounds as usual, passing by rooms filled with the soft hum of medical equipment and the occasional groan of the building settling. But then, as I passed by the emergency exit on the east side, I noticed something strange. The door was ajar, something I would have never left unattended, especially at this hour. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed it open. A cold draft hit me like a wave, and my breath became visible in the air, despite it being mid-July. It was as though I had stepped into a freezer. I hesitated but stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me, as if it had a mind of its own. The hallway stretched out before me, far longer than it should have been, the lights flickering overhead, casting long, grotesque shadows against the walls. The deeper I ventured, the more disorienting it became. The hallways twisted, and every door I passed seemed familiar yet foreign, like they belonged to rooms I'd never seen. There were no windows here, and the hum of the fluorescent lights above became deafening, vibrating through my skull like a bad migraine. I stopped in front of one of the doors, and without realizing it, I was gripping the handle. I couldn't recall how long I'd been standing there, but there was something in the air, something strange about this room. The walls were cracked and aged, as if the hospital had been here for decades longer than it should have been, and the door was splintered, like someone had been desperately trying to escape. With a shuddering breath, I pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, save for a flickering light in the far corner. The floor was covered in dust, and as I stepped inside, my foot caught on something. A paper, crumpled and torn, with only a few faint words still visible. "Don't look back." My skin prickled with unease, but I pressed on, drawn to the corner where the light flickered. The dim light revealed a mirror on the wall, cracked and warped, its surface reflecting a distorted version of the room. As I approached, I could hear something, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice trying to speak through the glass. I leaned closer, straining to hear, when suddenly the mirror cracked, a sharp sound that echoed through the room, and in the shattered reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing behind me, its face obscured by shadows. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. I backed away, my breath quickening, But as I did, the whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it was all around me, in my ears, my mind. I couldn't make out the words, but the terror in the voice was unmistakable. I had to leave. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic surged through me, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the handle, but it was stuck, frozen in place. And then I heard it, a slow, deliberate step, followed by another and another. Someone or something was coming down the hallway. The footsteps were heavy, dragging, and as they grew closer, the temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath came out in ragged clouds. I turned, my eyes scanning the room for any escape, but the shadows in the corner of the room shifted. A figure emerged from the darkness, slowly and methodically, its movements unnaturally stiff, like it was struggling to maintain its form. It was tall, towering over me, and its skin was pale and stretched too thin, as though it had been left to decay for years. Its eyes were black holes, empty and unblinking, and as it approached, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could barely breathe. I stumbled backward, my hands clawing at the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was getting closer, its presence overwhelming. I could hear its breath, ragged and wet, as if it was trying to inhale through a set of rotting lungs. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, sharp and broken, like something that had been twisted by time. I turned to the window, hoping to break through the glass and escape, but it was no use. The glass was warped and distorted, like looking through a funhouse mirror. My reflection was gone, replaced by the figure behind me, its face pressing against the glass, its features contorted into something grotesque. I screamed, pounding on the walls, but the sound was muffled, as though the hospital itself was swallowing my voice, trapping me in this hellish nightmare. I could feel the temperature drop further, my body freezing, and the figure's cold, clammy hand reached out toward me. My vision blurred as it drew closer, its touch like ice, burning through my skin. I could barely move, frozen in place by terror. And then, just as its fingers brushed against my arm, the lights went out. Total darkness enveloped me, and I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing. I didn't know what happened next, whether I passed out or if the darkness consumed me, but when I woke up, I was back in the hospital. The hallway was empty, silent again, and everything looked normal, too normal. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was standing in the same place I had been before, in front of that same damn door, and the whispers were gone. But when I checked my watch, I saw that hours had passed. And then it hit me, no one else was around. The hallways were empty. Every door I passed was locked, sealed, and the nurse's station was deserted. I had been alone, but now, I felt as if something was watching me from the shadows, from the corners of every room. The whispers had returned, softer now, but more insistent, as if they were calling me back to that room. I don't know how long I'll last here, in this hospital that seems to never end, but every time the lights flicker, I can feel it. Something is waiting, something that was never meant to be, and I fear that soon I won't be able to leave. I've worked the night shift at St. Agnes Hospital for over 2 years, and though I've seen my share of weird and unsettling things, tonight is different. Tonight, something feels wrong, like the hospital itself is breathing, alive in a way that I can't explain. It started when I noticed that the floor I was assigned to, the neurology ward, was eerily quiet, even for this time of night. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead seemed to pulse, like they were struggling to stay lit, and the shadows cast by the light flickered in a way that made the walls appear to move. At first, I brushed it off as just my imagination playing tricks on me from exhaustion. But that didn't explain the cold draft that blew through the hallways, despite all the windows being closed. I tried to focus on my duties, checking on patients, ensuring everything was in order, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't until I passed room 404 that I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. Room 404 had been empty for weeks. The patient had died suddenly, and the room had been locked up ever since. But tonight, the door was ajar, just slightly, as though someone had carelessly left it open. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I saw something move inside. I hesitated but felt compelled to investigate. As I stepped inside the room, the cold hit me first. It was like stepping into a freezer. The air was thick, and the silence was so complete it felt suffocating. I reached for the light switch, but before I could flip it, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the room with a force that made my heart race. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something heavy had pressed against it from the other side. Panic began to rise in my chest. I turned around, looking for another way out, but that's when I noticed it. The walls, the wallpaper, which had once been a muted beige, was peeling away in long, curling strips, revealing what looked like old, weathered stone beneath. But it wasn't just the walls that were wrong. It was the room itself. The bed, once neatly made, was now covered in dark stains, and the medical equipment that had been neatly stored beside it was scattered across the floor, some of it broken, others twisted in unnatural ways. My eyes darted around the room, but then I saw something move, slowly, deliberately. From the corner of the room, a shadow that crept across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. It was a figure, hunched and shrouded in darkness, its face obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me. I stepped back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the figure began to move toward me, its steps slow and heavy, as if it were savoring my fear. I turned to the door again, desperate to escape, but before I could reach it, the room seemed to stretch before me, the walls growing longer, the door growing farther away. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground in confusion. The figure reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers long and unnaturally thin. I could hear it whispering, its voice a low, guttural hiss, but the words were unintelligible, as if coming from a distance. Suddenly, the room went dark, and I felt a pressure on my chest as if something invisible was pushing me down, holding me in place. I gasped for air, struggling against the unseen weight, but the figure was too close now, its face emerging from the darkness. A face that was hollow, its eyes deep pits of emptiness, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out, but my hand passed through it, like it wasn't even there. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel the coldness in my bones, the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting. The air grew thicker, and the whispering became louder, more frantic, until it was all around me, the walls closing in, suffocating me. And then, I heard something else, voices, distant at first, but growing louder. They weren't from the figure, but from somewhere deeper within the hospital, from the very foundation of the building itself. They were the voices of the patients who had died here, the ones who had been forgotten, their memories fading with each passing year. They whispered of pain, of suffering, of lives cut short before their time, their voices mingling with the figures, creating a cacophony of terror that made my mind spin. I tried to block out the voices, tried to focus on anything, but then I saw it, the door. It was wide open now, and I could see the hallway beyond, but it was wrong. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, far longer than it should have been, and the lights flickered, casting strange shadows that twisted and contorted on the walls. I had to get out. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I stepped into the hallway, something tugged at my ankle, pulling me backward. I looked down, and the floor beneath me was cracked open, revealing a dark void that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The figure was gone, but I could feel it, its presence lingering, following me, and I could hear its whispers growing louder. "You can't leave," it said, its voice like the crackling of dead leaves. I reached out to the walls for support, but as I touched them, they crumbled away, revealing only more darkness. The floor beneath me felt unstable, as if the hospital itself were collapsing, pulling me into the abyss. Panic flooded my system, and I ran, not looking back. But no matter how far I went, the hallway never seemed to end. The whispers followed me, the coldness seeping deeper into my skin, and the figure, though invisible, was always just behind me. The walls began to close in, the floor cracking, and I stumbled as I ran, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't escape. The hospital was alive, a living, breathing entity that fed off the fear of those who walked its halls, and now it had claimed me. My body trembled as I reached the stairs, the final exit within my grasp. But when I stepped forward, the stairs disappeared, and I fell into the darkness. I was never meant to leave. I don't know if I'm still here, trapped in the labyrinth of St. Agnes, or if I've already become part of its dark history, but every night, I hear the whispers calling me, pulling me back, and I know that one day, I'll be just another voice among the forgotten, lost within the walls of the hospital that never truly ends. It was a cold winter night when I began my shift at St. Edward's Hospital, a place with a reputation for being more haunted than hospitable, but it paid well and had few people around at night. The building had been standing for over 100 years, its walls thick with the stories of past patients, some of whom had been forgotten, while others weren't allowed to leave. I had heard all the rumors, whispers of footsteps in empty halls, unexplained cries from rooms that were supposed to be abandoned, and the unsettling feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Still, I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until that night. As I walked through the front lobby, I passed the receptionist's desk, empty. No surprise, the night shift was always a skeleton crew. The flickering lights above me cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, but I ignored them, focusing on the task ahead. I had to make rounds, check on the patients, and ensure everything was quiet for the night. I started on the 3rd floor where the older rooms were located, rooms that had seen decades of change, some of them abandoned for years. The air was stale, and the light overhead flickered as I made my way down the corridor. The hospital had a musty smell, mixed with the distinct scent of disinfectant, which made my stomach churn. As I walked, I noticed the door to room 307 was slightly ajar, and the light inside was dim but still on. I thought nothing of it and knocked gently before entering. Inside, the bed was empty, but the 4-drip was still in place, and the heart monitor beeped softly in the corner. It didn't make sense. No one had been admitted to this room for weeks. The machine's soft beeping was rhythmic, almost soothing, but in that moment, it felt like something was wrong. The silence of the room was thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I checked the patient log on the wall, expecting to see a name, but there was nothing, just a blank space. As I reached to turn off the monitor, I felt something brush against my neck. I froze. It wasn't a breeze. It was something colder, like a breath, and it sent a chill down my spine. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I shrugged it off as my imagination and shut the door behind me, eager to leave the strange, empty room behind. But as I moved down the hallway, something else caught my attention. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and I heard a faint whisper coming from the stairwell. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't help but turn back toward the sound, my feet heavy with hesitation. It was coming from below, from the depths of the hospital, the basement, a place I had been warned to avoid, where no one ventured at night. I knew I should have ignored it, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I took the stairs down, each step creaking under my weight, and as I descended, the temperature dropped, the chill creeping into my bones. The basement was dark, and the air was thick with a dampness I hadn't expected. As I stepped into the corridor below, I could hear something else now, whispers, faint but unmistakable, like the soft murmur of voices coming from around the corner. I wasn't alone down here. I took a slow step forward, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, and that's when I saw them, shapes, figures moving just out of the reach of the light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were no longer just shadows, but people, pale, emaciated, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They shuffled toward me, their movements jerky, like marionettes with their strings tangled. My heart pounded in my chest as one of them reached out, its hand a skeletal claw, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Without thinking, I turned and ran back toward the stairs, the echoes of their footfalls growing louder behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the top floor, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm myself, but the feeling of eyes on me wouldn't leave. I was being watched. I knew it. The hospital, which had once felt so familiar, now seemed foreign, hostile. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The halls seemed longer than they had before, and the silence was thicker, more oppressive. As I turned the corner to head toward the nurse's station, I heard a door creak open behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching before me. But then, I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the far end of the corridor. My skin crawled as I slowly backed away, the sound of the footsteps growing louder with every passing second. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched impossibly longer, the distance to the nurse's station becoming further and further away, no matter how fast I moved. My chest tightened, and my breath became shallow as the footsteps reached me, their presence suffocating. I turned once more to face the sound, my heart racing, only to find myself staring into the empty eyes of a figure, its face pale and gaunt, its lips twisted into a smile that stretched too wide for any human to possess. It whispered my name, low and guttural, and I knew I had to get out. Get out before whatever that thing was claimed me as its own. I ran, but the hospital refused to let me go. The walls closed in on me, the hallways now endless, the doors no longer leading anywhere familiar. I stumbled into another room, desperate for any kind of escape, and that's when I saw it. A mirror hanging on the far wall, reflecting not my face, but something far worse. There, in the reflection, was the figure. Its hands pressed against the glass, its smile still wide, its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. I turned, but the figure was standing right behind me, its fingers brushing the back of my neck as it whispered again. "You're one of us now." The words echoed in my mind as I realized the truth. The hospital wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by something far worse, something that fed on the living, claiming them one by one, trapping their souls within these walls. And now it had claimed me too. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the hospital's main doors, sealed shut as though they had never existed. It was supposed to be just another quiet night shift at Riverstone Hospital, the kind I'd done countless times before, but this night was different. I had no idea then how wrong everything would go, how quickly things would change, how everything I thought I knew about this place would be shattered in the course of a few hours. The air in the hospital was thick with a stale, metallic smell, the kind that clung to everything, lingering in the hallways and corners, and the lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the walls, as if the darkness itself was waiting to pounce. I was the only one left on the floor. The late shift had trickled down to a mere handful of people, but the hospital had always felt empty at night. There was always a tension in the air, an eerie quiet that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Something that never came, but always seemed on the edge of happening. It wasn't until I got to room 303 that I felt it, the first strange thing. Room 303 had been vacant for weeks. The patient had passed away quietly in the night. No family, no visitors, nothing to disturb the stillness. But as I passed the door, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A figure, a shadow. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination, but the shadow shifted, a movement too deliberate to be mistaken for a trick of the light. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, and stared at the door, my breath catching in my throat. I knew I shouldn't go in, that I should just walk away, but curiosity tugged at me. I had to know what was happening. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, but not empty. The bed was made, the 4 stands stood untouched, but the air inside was cold, too cold, as though it had been locked away from the rest of the hospital. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place, except for the sensation of eyes on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, like a voice from far away, calling my name. It echoed around the room, yet no one was there. I turned to leave, my legs trembling, but something caught my attention. On the floor, by the bed, was a piece of paper, crumpled and torn. I knelt down to pick it up, my hands shaking. The paper was old, brittle. The ink faded, but the words were clear. "They are all still here." I stared at the note, my heart sinking. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and suddenly the air in the room felt thicker, heavier, as though the walls were closing in. I turned to leave, but as I did, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the hospital was silent, and no one answered. My pulse raced as I backed away from the door, only to find that the shadows in the corners of the room were no longer just shadows. They were moving, twisting, creeping closer. I tried to scream, but my throat felt dry. My voice caught in my chest. The shadows began to take shape, becoming more defined, until I could see them. Figures, faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for me, their hands skeletal and cold. Panic set in, and I rushed toward the window, slamming my fists against the glass, but it didn't break. It felt like it was alive, resisting me, trapping me in the room with the dead. I backed away, and that's when I saw it. The thing in the corner, the figure I hadn't noticed before. It was standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark, its mouth stretched wide in a grin that was too big for its face. I knew then that it wasn't just a patient or a ghost. It was something worse. Something that had been waiting in the hospital for years, feeding off the fear of the living. It stepped closer, and I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing thick with the scent of decay. It opened its mouth, and the whisper that escaped sent a chill straight to my bones. "You're not leaving." I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, but the hospital seemed to stretch on forever. The corridors twisted, the walls seemed to close in, and I couldn't find the exit. Every room I entered was just like the last. Empty, cold, and haunted. The shadows followed me, growing larger, and the whispers grew louder until they were all around me, drowning out everything else. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. The darkness was everywhere, and it was closing in. I stumbled into another room, but this one was different. The lights flickered on, and I saw the faces. Dozens of them, pale, lifeless, their eyes wide open, staring at me from the bed. Their mouths were open, but no sound came out. I backed away, horrified, but they didn't move. They just watched me, their silent gaze following my every movement. Then I heard it, a soft footstep behind me. I turned, but no one was there. The door slammed shut again, and I was trapped. I was surrounded. There was no way out. The walls seemed to be closing in, the floor sinking beneath my feet. The faces on the beds began to whisper, their voices low and guttural, their words unrecognizable. Then, from the far corner, I saw it again, the figure, the one with the glowing eyes. It stepped forward, its grin stretching impossibly wide, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was coming for me. I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers, the sound of the walls closing in, the figure's footsteps growing louder, until there was nothing left but the darkness, the shadows, and the cold hands that reached out to pull me into the void. And in that moment, I understood. The hospital wasn't just haunted by the dead. It was alive, feeding on the living, trapping them in its endless maze of corridors, inescapable, eternal. And now, I was just another lost soul, another whisper in the dark, forever part of the Riverstone Hospital's twisted legacy. Hospitals always unnerved me, with their sterile white walls and the faint, chemical tang of antiseptics lingering in the air. But when I took the night shift at St. Eustace Memorial, desperation outweighed fear. I needed the money, and the quiet hours promised time to study for my exams. The hospital was old, too old, with a history that read more like a ghost story. Tales of patients vanishing, staff hearing screams echoing through empty corridors, and a mysterious Ward 13, rumored to have been sealed off decades ago after a patient riot turned deadly. It was, of course, nonsense, or so I told myself as I stood at my station in the lonely, dimly lit hallway of the 3rd floor, my only companion the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. My shift had been uneventful until midnight, when the power flickered for the first time, plunging the hallway into brief darkness before the emergency generators kicked in, bathing everything in a sickly yellow glow. That was when I noticed it, the faint hum of a heart monitor, steady and persistent, though all the rooms in my ward were empty. At first, I thought it was a malfunction, but as I walked toward the sound, clipboard in hand, the noise seemed to grow louder, pulling me toward room 307, a room that should have been unoccupied but now stood ajar, the faint green glow of a monitor spilling into the hallway. My heart raced as I pushed the door open, half expecting to find a patient lying in the bed, but the room was empty save for the monitor, its screen displaying a steady heartbeat that didn't belong to anyone. Unease prickled at the back of my neck as I turned the machine off, the room falling silent once more, but as I stepped back into the hallway, I heard it again. Another monitor, this time from room 309, its beep frantic and erratic. I hurried to the room, the hairs on my arms standing on end as I found it in the same state, the bed empty but the monitor alive, its screen flickering with jagged lines that seemed almost frantic. This time, when I reached to turn it off, the door slammed shut behind me, and the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that my breath turned to mist in front of me. I froze, too terrified to move, and then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, coming from the far corner of the room where the shadows seemed to writhe as though alive. "Help me?" the voice rasped, and though every instinct screamed at me to run, my legs felt rooted to the spot as the shadows coalesced into a shape. A figure hunched and trembling, its face obscured by the darkness. "Please, don't leave me here," it whimpered, and before I could even process what I was seeing, the figure lunged forward, its claw-like hands outstretched, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the monitor, which let out a piercing scream that echoed through the ward. The next thing I knew, I was in the hallway, the door to room 309 shut tightly behind me, my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to call for help, but my radio was dead, the signal replaced by static interspersed with faint whispers that sent chills racing down my spine. The hallway stretched impossibly long before me, the exit at the far end seeming to recede with every step I took, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder and faster as I broke into a run. The lights above me flickered violently, plunging the corridor into strobing chaos, and as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw them. Figures in hospital gowns, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes black voids that bore into me as they shuffled forward with jerky, unnatural movements. I ran blindly, turning corner after corner, my lungs burning as the hallway twisted and warped around me. The walls now lined with doors that hadn't been there before, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of horrors I can barely describe. A figure strapped to a gurney, thrashing as unseen hands pulled at their limbs. A woman in a nurse's uniform, her face contorted into a rictus grin as she held a scalpel dripping with blood. And worst of all, a child sitting cross-legged on the floor, his empty gaze fixed on me as he whispered, "It's your turn," I screamed, slamming one door shut after another. But the whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent until they became a deafening roar that seemed to come from within my own skull. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I stumbled into an elevator at the end of the hall, frantically pressing the button for the ground floor as the doors slid shut, cutting off the cacophony outside. I thought I was safe, but as the elevator began to descend, the air grew heavy, and a sickly sweet smell filled the space, making my stomach churn. The lights flickered, and I realized with growing dread that the buttons were changing. The numbers replaced by symbols I couldn't decipher, each one more grotesque than the last. The elevator stopped with a jolt, and when the doors opened, I found myself in a ward unlike any I'd seen before. The walls were lined with beds, each one occupied by a figure shrouded in shadows, their breathing shallow and irregular. A nurse stood at the far end, her back to me, humming a lullaby that sent shivers racing down my spine. When she turned, her face was a nightmare. A grotesque amalgamation of features stitched together, her eyes empty sockets that oozed black ichor as she smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You're late," she crooned, her voice a sickly sweet mockery of kindness, and she extended a hand toward me, her fingers unnaturally long and tipped with claws. I backed away, only to feel cold hands grip my shoulders, and as I turned, I found myself surrounded by the figures from the hallway, their blank eyes staring into my soul as they whispered in unison, "Join us." I don't know how I escaped. I remember running, the walls closing in around me, the air growing thick with the stench of decay, and then I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face as I collapsed onto the pavement. When I looked back, the hospital stood silent and dark, its windows empty and lifeless, but as I staggered away, I heard it. The faint hum of a heart monitor, steady and persistent, echoing in the back of my mind. The last thing I remember before stepping through the rusted gates of St. Arcanum's asylum was the storm that had swallowed the moon. The sky ripped apart by flashes of lightning that seemed to illuminate the decayed, monstrous silhouette of the hospital. I had come here on a dare, a fool's errand, perhaps, but curiosity was always my weakness, and when my so-called friends bet that I wouldn't last an hour inside, pride overrode common sense. As I pushed the door open, it groaned like a dying animal, revealing a labyrinth of peeling walls and corridors that stretched endlessly, each reeking of antiseptic and damp rot. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though the building itself had drawn in a deep, eternal breath and refused to let it go. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, the beam trembling as much as my hand, and every step I took seemed to awaken the building, its ancient bones creaking and groaning, the shadows shifting as though they had lives of their own. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the still, peaceful kind, but the oppressive, weighty silence that seemed to buzz and hum in your ears, filling the void with things you couldn't quite hear but felt nonetheless. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as I moved deeper into the asylum, the whispers began, soft, unintelligible murmurs that slid just beneath the threshold of comprehension. I whipped around, my flashlight catching glimpses of shattered gurneys, rusted surgical instruments, and the crumbling remains of medical charts scattered across the floor, but nothing living or dead came into view. The whispers grew louder, a symphony of unseen voices that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my racing heart, and the smell of something foul, like burnt hair and decayed flesh, began to claw at my nostrils. That was when I found the first room. It was labeled Ward 13, its door barely hanging onto its hinges, and inside the walls were painted, not with any color I could recognize, but with a dark, congealed substance that made my stomach lurch. The words "Don't look back" were scrawled across the far wall, each letter dripping with that same unholy sludge, and the bed in the center was covered in restraints, the kind meant for someone or something that wasn't meant to leave. I backed out of the room, my pulse pounding in my ears, and turned to find the corridor had changed. It was no longer straight but twisted, as though the asylum itself had bent reality, and the walls seemed to pulse, bulging inward and outward as though they were alive. I ran, my breath catching in my throat as the whispers turned to screams, piercing, guttural cries that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, each one filled with pain and rage and despair. The air grew colder with each step, my breath condensing in frantic bursts, and I stumbled into another room, my flashlight flickering as though it too were terrified. This room was different. It was pristine, almost too pristine, like it had been preserved in time, untouched by the decay that consumed the rest of the building. A single wheelchair sat in the center, its leather straps worn and frayed, and as I approached, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a cold hand gripping my heart. The chair began to move, slowly at first, then violently, as though an invisible force was trapped within, desperate to escape. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, and the walls began to close in, the ceiling pressing downward as though the room intended to swallow me whole. Panic set in as I clawed at the door, screaming for help, but the asylum only mocked me, the walls echoing my cries back in distorted, inhuman tones. When the door finally gave way, I spilled out into a corridor that shouldn't have existed, its walls lined with jars containing things. I couldn't bring myself to look too closely, but each jar seemed to hold something worse than the last. An eyeball that twitched, a severed hand that clawed at the glass, and a fetus-like creature with a twisted grin that seemed to stare straight into my soul. The whispers returned, but now they were distinct, each voice vying for dominance in a cacophony of madness. They spoke my name. They knew me. They hated me. I don't know how long I wandered through those endless, shifting halls, minutes, hours, days. Time had no meaning here, and my flashlight was useless against the growing darkness that seemed to swallow the light whole. Doors appeared where none had been, leading to rooms filled with horrors I cannot unsee. Surgical theaters still coated in blood, their floors slick with unidentifiable fluids. Morgues where the drawers banged open and shut as though the dead within were demanding release. And mirrors that showed not my reflection, but something else. Something that watched me, grinned at me, and mimicked my movements with just enough delay to make my skin crawl. The final room I entered was the worst. It was a nursery, or what had once been a nursery, filled with cribs that rocked on their own, their lullabies playing in reverse, and toys that moved as though guided by invisible hands. In the corner stood a figure, a nurse or what remained of one, her head lolling at an impossible angle, her eyes hollow and black, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that split her face in two. She raised a hand, beckoning me, and though every fiber of my being screamed to run, my legs betrayed me, carrying me forward as though I were a puppet on strings. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a voice but a chorus, the voices of every damned soul that had ever walked these halls. And she whispered, "You're home now." The room dissolved into darkness, and I woke in the same corridor where I had begun. But this time the doors were sealed, the whispers gone, and the silence absolute. I ran to the entrance, my legs barely carrying me, and burst out into the stormy night, only to find the gates locked and the asylum standing silent, its windows dark and unbroken. I was free, but as I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in a puddle, and staring back at me was the nurse's grotesque grin. It began as an ordinary overnight shift at Greystone General, a decaying hospital on the edge of town that had long since fallen into obscurity, known more for urban legends than modern medicine, and yet there I was, fresh out of nursing school, ready to prove myself. My first night on call was quiet, too quiet, as though the building itself was holding its breath, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above me as I wandered through the dimly lit corridors, checking charts and ensuring patients were stable. The other nurses had warned me about the East Wing, the part of the hospital that had been closed off years ago after a fire gutted the maternity ward and claimed the lives of several staff and patients. But I'd brushed off their ghost stories as nothing more than the superstitions of tired minds. It wasn't until I heard the distant echo of a baby's cry, faint, almost fragile, that I felt the first prick of unease, a sensation that curled around my spine and settled deep in my chest. I told myself it was my imagination, but the sound persisted, growing louder as the night wore on, until I found myself standing before the locked double doors of the East Wing, my hand trembling as it hovered over the padlock that should have kept the horrors within at bay. To my shock, the lock was unlatched, the chain hanging loose as though it had been waiting for someone. Waiting for me. I hesitated, every rational thought screaming at me to turn back, but something deeper, curiosity, fear, or perhaps something darker, compelled me to push the doors open and step into the forbidden wing, where the air was colder, thicker, and carried the unmistakable stench of mildew and burnt flesh. My flashlight flickered weakly as I moved forward, my footsteps echoing against the cracked tiles, and the sound of the crying baby grew sharper, cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. The first room I passed was a long-abandoned operating theater, its walls blackened with soot, the surgical table still adorned with rusted tools that looked more like instruments of torture than medicine. And as I shone my light across the room, I saw the faint outline of handprints smeared into the walls, small, childlike, and disturbingly fresh. My pulse quickened as I pressed on, each step dragging me deeper into the heart of the East Wing, where the walls seemed to close in around me, and shadows danced just beyond the edge of my vision. I found myself in a hallway lined with patient rooms, the doors ajar, each revealing a tableau of horror. A wheelchair overturned in a pool of dried blood. A bed still strapped with restraints that hung loose, as though their occupant had slipped free. And worst of all, a nurse's cart overturned, its contents scattered across the floor, including a pair of scissors that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against my ears. And for a moment, I thought I was alone. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal, coming from the room at the end of the hall. My feet moved of their own accord as I approached the door, my flashlight barely holding on as the batteries began to fail, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Inside the room, I found an old crib, its white paint chipped and peeling, and inside lay a doll. Its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing, and its tiny mouth frozen in a grotesque smile. As I stepped closer, the doll's head turned with an audible click, and from its mouth came a high-pitched giggle that sent shivers racing down my spine. The door slammed shut behind me, and the temperature in the room plummeted, my breath escaping in frantic, visible puffs as the walls began to pulse, the peeling wallpaper undulating like flesh. The whispers started then, low and guttural, voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but their malice was unmistakable, each syllable dripping with venom. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, and the room seemed to shrink, the shadows pressing in closer until I was certain they would swallow me whole. When the whispers stopped, the silence was even worse, and I turned to find the doll gone, the crib empty except for a single scrap of fabric that looked suspiciously like hospital scrubs. My flashlight failed completely, plunging me into darkness, and I felt something brush against my arm. A cold, clammy touch that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, only to feel another hand grip my shoulder, its fingers digging into my flesh with unnatural strength, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't be here," I screamed, tearing free and throwing myself against the door, which gave way with a deafening crash, and I fell into the hallway, my heart pounding as I scrambled to my feet. The corridor had changed. The walls were now covered in grotesque murals, scenes of unspeakable suffering painted in blood and ash, and the floor beneath me felt slick, as though I were walking on something alive. The crying began again, louder this time, and it was joined by a chorus of other sounds, screams, laughter, and the distant clatter of footsteps that seemed to come from every direction. I ran blindly, my only thought to escape, but the hospital had become a maze, its corridors looping back on themselves, leading me to doors that opened into rooms I had already fled. My lungs burned as I pushed forward, and then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hall, its silhouette backlit by a flickering light. It was a nurse, or at least what used to be one, her uniform stained and tattered, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her face obscured by a veil of shadows. She began to move toward me, her footsteps slow but deliberate, and as she passed under the light, I saw her face, or rather, the gaping void where her face should have been, a hollow blackness that seemed to suck in all the light around it. I turned and ran, tears streaming down my face as the whispers rose to a deafening roar, the walls around me shaking and cracking, pieces of the ceiling raining down as the hospital seemed to collapse upon itself. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled into the main corridor, the double doors to the east wing slamming shut behind me with a force that shook the ground. The whispers ceased, and the air grew still, but the silence offered no comfort. It felt watchful, as though the hospital itself were waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't wait to find out. I ran through the main doors and into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a blessing as I collapsed onto the pavement. When I looked back, the east wing was dark, its windows empty and lifeless, but I could still hear the faint echo of a baby's cry, a sound that will haunt me until my dying day.